Yeah,
Yes.
because they can vote.
All right, we are live on YouTube.
Good afternoon. This is the Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee here with EAN, Jared Duvall, and we will go around and introduce ourselves. We'll start with the chair and vice chair on Zoom.
Hi, everybody. I'm Representative Kathleen James from Manchester.
Hello, I'm Representative Scott Campbell from St. Johnsbury.
Richard Bailey, LaVille 2.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Graham Kleppner, Chittenden 13, Burlington.
For Sibilia, Wyndham 2.
Jack Locker, Committee Assistant.
Take it back.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Sibilia. Thank you, members of the committee, for having me in today. My name is Jared Duvall. I serve as Executive Director of Energy Action Network. I think this is fifth or sixth time back with you, so I won't go through all of the introduction like I normally do, but I will just say, for purposes of those who may be viewing online or watching the recording, Energy Action Network is an independent nonprofit organization that conducts data tracking, research, and analysis for the state of Vermont. And what I'm planning to share with you today is a just released research paper that we've completed. It's up on our website at eanvt.org. I shared it with Jack, and I believe it's available with the committee documents for testimony today. But what the report is about is that since 2017, the Vermont Tax Department has tracked volumes sold of fossil heating fuels, fuel oil, propane, and we also are able to get that same data in terms of total statewide sales for fossil gas or natural gas from VGS. And then for a long time, the tax department has collected and reported, it's most easily accessible through JFO, the sales volumes for gasoline and diesel. So the report is an overall look at what is happening with fossil fuel sales and consumption in the state of Vermont over the last about 8 years, 2017 to 2024. And what can we learn from that data in terms of the Vermont economy, what it means for Vermont consumers, and also an initial look for what it means for our greenhouse gas emissions, certainly in those sectors which we're able to estimate, and using the data that's currently available to us, also make some estimates for statewide emissions and what that may mean for the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Great. And Jared, let me just, I think we have one more person, Lena.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry. Lena and I are together. Lena is EAN's data manager and research analyst and co-author of this paper. So
Welcome.
Hi, Lynn.
Okay.
Okay, so I am going to go ahead.
Am I passing these out or just giving? Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Okay. And then I was curious, if anyone doesn't want their copy, I would love a copy of this. Do you think you could tell Mrs. Waiter or something?
I can
Or does that not?
Good to go?
You're good to go.
Jack.
It's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Jack.
Thank you.
You can
I can always
you
ask
can give
for
a copy right now. I think that one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wait, hey, Paige, stop. Come back and make my copy.
Oh,
Thank you.
I love that.
So can folks online see my cover slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So if you're interested in reading this paper in full at any point, this is a screenshot of the cover of the paper on the right. It is available if you go to eanvt.org and search for research and reports. It's the top of the list. There's also an executive summary available there as well. So what I was planning to do, and please let me know if I should adjust this, is I've prepared probably about a half hour of slides to go through some of the key findings in this research paper. First, focus on the economic analysis, and then moving to the emissions analysis, and then saving whatever balance of time the committee would like for questions and discussion.
Madam Chair, does that align with your hopes and dreams for this afternoon session?
Fully.
Great. Please proceed.
Okay, so first I want to just summarize before we get into the content, some of the good news and the bad news in this paper. So let's start with the good news. And that is that overall statewide fossil fuel consumption has been trending downward. I think there's an important caveat to that, though, which is it's been happening slowly and largely supported by federal funding that is now either going away or facing uncertainty. Similarly, and not surprisingly, given how these two things are related, Vermont's greenhouse gas pollution has also been trending downward. And based on the most recent data that we've been able to access, our estimate at EAN is that Vermont has seen a 16 to 21% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels as of 2024. And this is thanks primarily to Vermonters who are stepping up to take actions to cut pollution and often to reduce energy costs as well. We have seen nearly, as this is as of the end of 2024, nearly 18,000 electric vehicles registered, over 40,000 homes comprehensively weatherized, over 20,000 heat pump water heaters installed, and over 70,000 cold climate heat pump units installed. Oops. Continuing the good news is that those technologies, those actions continue to be available to us, and they present an opportunity to lower energy bills and provide greater price stability for Vermonters. And those include, again, not all of the time. It depends kind of what your current energy setup is, what variables like what your home is like, what your transportation needs are, what utility territory you're in. But oftentimes, the solutions that can reduce climate pollution are also measures that can reduce energy costs, including electric vehicles, weatherization, heat pump water heaters, heat pump systems, and advanced wood heating systems. And I promise you, even though I'm going to go to the bad news, I am going to end this presentation with more good news. But to go to the bad news, 2024 was the third year in a row that statewide fossil fuel costs exceeded $2 billion for Vermont. And if we adjust those numbers for inflation, then every year since 2017, except for 2020, saw statewide fossil fuel costs over $2 billion if we're measuring 2024 dollars. That's about 5% of the statewide economy in 2024. But more important than those big numbers is what that translates to in terms of costs for family and business budgets for Vermonters. And the price volatility of global fossil fuel markets led to really large price increases, especially in the period of 2020 to 2021 to 2022. And so part of what we did is we looked at all of this tax department data, the VGS data, the JFO data. We looked at it by month, and then we looked at the average reported prices for each of those fuels by month to get not just total volume sold, but what did that mean for costs to Vermonters? And you'll see in a slide that I'm about to get to, it meant that collectively as a state, our costs, this amount of spending that we did on fossil fuels as a state, comparing 2020 to 2020, 2022 to 2020, there was an increase of nearly $1,800 per Vermonter, so over $1 billion in increased fossil fuel costs comparing 2020 to 2022.
Representative Furman.
Costs were exceeded 2 billion, but increased by $1 billion.
Yeah,
This is a large percent increase.
yes, nearly doubled.
Oh. 20 to 22.
Yes,
What about 17 to 24?
I'll show that.
Well, I mean, you got 2000. When did I came home in March of February 20 was the pandemic.
That's the
started.
pandemic, yeah.
And so February 20, March of 20 or April of 20, you had to pay to get rid of your futures contract.
That's right. It was negative.
So
Pricing.
there was negative pricing. So, yeah, so would that skew the,
I'll show that.
I mean, yeah, so we didn't go anywhere in 2020.
Rep. Southworth.
I need to back up to the first bullet point. I'm having a hard time understanding this. It says, and adjusted for inflation every year since 2017, except 2020, saw statewide fossil fuel costs over $2 billion as measured in 2024 dollars.
That's right.
I'm really lost with that concept.
So if we just look at the cost in those years, like the nominal cost in 2017, that was below $2 billion.
Okay.
But if you translate that into the purchasing power of 2024 dollars, so that we're talking consistently in current dollars, then it would have been over $2 billion.
Inflation
So the
adjusted.
same year
Inflation
happened
adjusted.
this year.
All right, but we're talking about an actual cost in 1 year, but we're making it look like it was a different cost in 2024. Am I understanding that correctly?
You got it.
Wait.
I'm just,
Let him answer the
yes, I'm just trying to understand.
Maybe it might help if I show the graph. So these are the actual costs, the nominal costs in each of those years. And you can see the effect of the price volatility. And the most important thing I want to point out here is that fossil fuel consumption, we did see, as Representative Howland said,
Okay,
a
right.
decline in 2020, but it was relatively, it was nowhere near but sorry, I should say after 2020, fossil fuel consumption was relatively flat, but the costs spiked significantly. So it wasn't as a result of buying much more fossil fuel, it was a result of price spikes and paying more for roughly the same amount of fuel. So this gray line shows fossil fuel consumption in trillion BTU, levelized for energy use. What you see in the bars, though, is the amount of money that we spent for that fossil fuel consumption, and it's broken down by fuel type. And so Vermonters experienced significant increases in prices, especially in gasoline and diesel and propane and fuel oil. And that's what led to the statewide cost increases and the price increases at a family and business budget level that you see represented here.
So, excuse me, but when you lump all the money together, and when you do it in dollars, it's difficult. But if we did it in gallons, because people didn't travel, well, how much does a family use in heating and stationary fuel versus travel fuel? So,
and that's what's shown here in the gray is the consumption. It's not labeled gallons because fossil gas or natural gas, whatever you want to call it, is measured in billion cubic feet. And so to get to a common unit of usage, we're using BTUs or British thermal units rather than gallons. But the gallons sold of propane, of diesel, of gasoline, etc., are showing up in that fossil fuel consumption line.
I didn't read the left. I was concentrating on the dollars. So.
Representative Southworth, did you have a question?
When I look at the graph, I'm even more confused with that statement because the graph shows 2017 through 2021 under $2 billion each year. Yet the statement says with inflation, which I don't see how that fits in because you have 5 years that are under the $2 billion and the other three, they're over 2 billion. So that's understandable.
So let me take a shot at this, Jared.
Rich had his hand up.
Yeah, no, you read these things that say, like my parents bought their house in Wardsboro for $18,000 in 1963, which would be the equivalent of $450,000 today, right? Like you've seen those statements about, anything that was purchased a long time in the past, they translated into what it would be today. And that's all that this is doing. It's saying you spent $1.63 billion in 2017, which would be the equivalent of to whatever today. Because, in 2017, you could buy a sheet of plywood for $20 and now that same sheet's $40 or whatever it is.
I just don't understand the significance of that when we actually see numbers where it shows it was below. That's all. And I'll leave it at that.
And I apologize if it created confusion. Oftentimes people want to be able
Well,
to
it did
look
for
at
me.
it both. People want to be able to look at it both ways. So we try to show what were the nominal prices in those years, but we also try to adjust it for inflation. So regardless of how you want to look, we're providing that option. So that's all I was trying to do. Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill?
Yeah, my issue with these numbers here is the only thing that left the state with these dollars was the profit. Okay, but otherwise, so if they went to New York and buy their fuel oil, the markup is what they paid for it. Comes back. So the only thing that's staying in New York is the profit. If all that comes back here and all these Vermont, all this money is spent here in Vermont. Buying from the fuel dealers.
Yeah.
Paying employees. Those people are paying property taxes.
Yeah.
So I always get this conception that we're shipping billions of dollars out of state when in fact the only thing that's going out of state is the profit from the initial buy.
Yeah, so I've got a slide that will address that shortly. This isn't saying anything about dollar flows in and out of state. This is just total spending.
Okay.
Right.
Rep Allen, and then, Jared, did you skip a few slides?
Yeah.
We'll have you go back. Okay, Rep
So
Allen?
the right hand, the BTUs gotta have some fluctuation. They can't be a straight line. That 60 BTU opposite the 2 billion can't be a straight line. If it's adjusted for inflation, the BTUs are constant.
That's right. The gray line is relative to that right-hand y-axis of the B2s.
All right, I'm sorry.
And so you're seeing them fluctuate.
Good. It's good to get this. There's a
Yeah.
lot going on.
So, yeah, I'm sorry. Sometimes when we're trying to present two types of information that are related or have a relationship, we'll use two y-axes. So the left-hand y-axis is showing total dollars, and that relates to those stacked bars of total fossil fuel costs.
So
And the gray line is related. We tried to color code it. So you see,
well, yeah,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, but okay, now
Yeah.
I understand the relatively flat BTU line.
It's okay. Better to ask the question so we get the information. All right, Jared, can you go back and
yes,
the slides that you skipped over?
yes.
Is everybody ready to go back? Yes.
And so for exactly the reason that Representative Helen said, you can choose your years for comparison, but 2020 was a pandemic year. So even though that was very much real for Vermont, that we experienced a massive cost increase between 20 and 22. If you just look at a year-to-year comparison, 21 to 22, that was about a 38% cost increase. The other bad news relates to emissions, and that is that based on our analysis, we I believe that it's almost certain that Vermont did not meet the first emissions reduction deadline of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is the deadline of January 1st, 2025, but it refers to 2024 annual emissions. And since we have almost all of the data that we need to calculate the two largest polluting sectors, transportation and thermal, from this tax department, DGS and JFO data, we're able to do an early estimate of what those emissions are.
So the official evaluation will be, is it 27?
Usually there's about a 3-year delay. And so the state's official greenhouse gas inventory and forecast is produced by the Agency of Natural Resources. The last one came out last spring and it went through 2021. The next one is supposed to come out sometime this spring or early summer and will take us through 2022. And the primary reason that there is this 3-year time lag is because, as I understand it, and I've been told by staff at ANR, of a time lag that relates to one specific sector, and that's the agricultural sector, where the emissions are primarily estimated using an Environmental Protection Agency state inventory tool that creates that time lag. But many of the other sectors, including transportation and thermal, are two largest emitting sectors. We know what the fuel use and therefore can calculate the emissions for those in near real time without that timeline. So we don't have a full picture, but we have most of the picture already. So based on the data that is currently available, EAN estimates that 2024 statewide greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont were likely between 7.75 to 8.29 million metric tons. And that would translate to falling somewhere between 18 to 39% short of Vermont's first statewide emissions reduction obligation under the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I'll get to that. But if it's okay, let's dive in and start with the economic analysis, which we've already started with.
Yes.
So now, apologies, I hope I don't create confusion by doing this. This show, I just told you that we have the data for 2024, but that's just for fossil fuels. We don't have the electricity sales data yet for 2024. So the most recent year we can give you a total picture of energy spending in the state is 2023. And that's what this pie chart, donut chart, bagel chart, whatever round food item you want to compare this to is showing. So in the blue, you see our statewide electricity spending. In the green, you see statewide transportation fuel spending, mostly gasoline and then some diesel. And then in the orange, you see our thermal sector spending, fuel oil, propane, fossil gas, some other fossil fuel, and wood. So Vermont's total energy spending about $3.3 billion in 2023. And again, over $2 billion of that was for fossil fuels. This is the look specifically at fossil fuels. And we've already spoken quite a bit about this, so I might just move on. And you see this is zooming out even further over time. Again, this is inflation adjusted, so this is all in 2024 dollars. We also produce a version of this graph that's not inflation adjusted, if you'd like to see that. But the story is the same either way.
So going with inflation adjusted, so it would seem to me that would be more accurate in terms of showing volatility. No?
The shape of the graph, actually, of the lines, you end up seeing the same movement. The difference is that in more recent years, this would, if we didn't adjust it for inflation, this would be like steadily moving up, but with the same shape. What it does is it kind of like keeps this flatter because of the purchasing power of a 2024 dollar relative to earlier years. I'm sorry I didn't produce that graph, but it would be these same shapes, but just moving upward more rather than being kind of in this.
So if you're
flatter
showing
space.
an increase that isn't necessarily, I don't need to put any more words. I think I understand.
Yeah. So, for instance, like if you let's look at the most obvious parts of this graph. So this pink spike in kerosene about in 2023.
Yeah.
If this hadn't been inflation adjusted, it would look much higher than this pink peak in around 2008. But and nominally it was, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, much higher than this. But if you adjust it for inflation, you see that it was about the same cost.
Burden on an individual.
Yeah, somebody purchasing that fuel.
Yeah.
But the thing that does not change, no matter what way you look at it, adjusted for inflation, not adjusted for inflation, is the incredible amount of price volatility in the global fossil fuel commodity market, especially for propane, fuel oil, and kerosene.
Chair James has a question. Don't look at the screen.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks. Just a couple, I just want to make sure. Okay, so fossil gas, that's natural gas. So that's up in VT gas territory. So I'm just looking to see which prices are the most stable.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So natural gas is the lowest and most stable. Electric is the next lowest and most stable. And then what's electric resistance?
So the blue line there that you noted is the second kind of lowest and most price stable is heating with using electricity to heat with heat pumps. And this is really interesting because, as you just noted, Chair James, if you compare that to the yellow line at the top, the electric resistance, you'll see that those have the same electricity rate. It's the average when this was published in December 2024 of 22 cents a kilowatt hour. But the reason that they show up so differently on the graph is because we're showing the price for the amount of delivered heat. And heat pumps work so much more efficiently than electric resistance heating, like space heaters or baseboard resistance heaters. that they can provide much more heat for the same amount of money, or stated differently, for the same provide the same amount of heat for much less money. Is that what I just said? So that's why those two forms of heating show up so differently on this graph, because of the efficiency of the technology in terms of how much energy is needed to produce heat, and a lot less energy is needed to produce or provide heat in a heat pump system than it is in a resistance electric system.
Okay, thanks.
Rep Sackler?
Your fuel oil, does that encompass all grades of fuel? One,
That's number 2 fuel oil.
so number 2, is that just dyed or is that clear on road?
That would be maybe late. I believe that is, so I have a diesel for transportation, but for fuel oil, this wouldn't be, this would be heating fuel, number 2 heating
So
fuel.
there are places that use other than number 2 for heating.
Yeah.
Is that inclusive in this or?
We don't have that here. There are other heating fuels that we have included in the past. We took them off because it just got too busy, like wood chips for commercial, or some commercial or larger institutional operations will use a different grade of fuel oil, like a bunker fuel kind of. But we're only showing the most common ones here.
So, like, just to further that, I just want to make sure that we're not, if you're doing dyed number 2 fuel, we're not including anything sold dyed number 2 for agriculture or off-road use, right?
That's right. That's
Okay.
not on here. So we produced this graph to show what this would be like for an average Vermont household that uses that heats their home in different ways. And so each fuel, fossil gas in purple, wood pellets in blue, whole home heat pumps in green, fuel oil furnace in orange, propane furnace in yellow, we show what using the fuel prices from those years and the average heating load and the efficiencies of those units, what average fuel costs would be for Vermonters heating an average home in Vermont each of those years, 2020 through 2024.
Is this also inflation adjusted?
This is not.
This is not.
This is not.
Okay.
This is the price you paid in each of those years on average if you were using these heating systems with these fuels. And it's just another way to see what does it mean at a household budget level? How does the relative price stability or relative price volatility of these fuels translate to Vermonters in terms of what they have to pay for them?
Yes, Steve Zandori.
So I'm sorry I was late, by the way. I was at presentations on this. So the wood pellets have been reasonably affordable, so that's why they look similar to the heat pumps, but they're much less efficient, right?
It depends on, as compared to a heat pump, yes.
Yes.
They're similar they're similar efficiencies to other combustion conveyances.
Being similar bar heights is more about their cost.
That's right.
And their cost is trending up, it looks like.
Yeah, it has been, but not with the same level of.
Yeah, well,
But I do have a graph that I can show later that compares the efficiencies of these different units, not just the costs.
When you started your presentation and estimated how much time, I almost said,
Yeah.
always
Exactly.
because we don't have questions.
So you saw the ranges by year. This just simplifies it into one average cost for each of those heating systems over the last 5 years. But it also allows you to compare not just the cost of those heating types, but what the emissions from those heating types would create on average annually, if you want to compare those. So you can see, for instance, that that both the highest cost and the highest polluting ways to heat are fuel oil and propane. The tallest blue bars, the tallest orange bars. And then, some of the lower cost ways to heat, they're not all, fossil gas does create quite a large, significantly more pollution than whole home heat pumps or wood pellet furnace, but it is lower cost in terms of the direct price folks are paying. So this is again, we're always trying to do two things: look at a statewide level and then bring it down to a really accessible. What does this mean for me and my home, me and my family? And so this is an example of how energy costs have changed for a Vermont household over the last 6 years. And now people heat and drive many different ways. There's no, consistency. So we always have to pick out examples that are representative. So this is an example showing a home that uses fuel oil for heating with a furnace and has 2 gasoline cars. And these are the average costs that they would have faced for heating and transportation over this period. And then you can see the electricity costs on the bottom.
I really appreciate that you've included the electricity costs here, which are not volatile. Yeah, they're steady. They're steady. They don't go up and down. They're rate regulated.
By choice, yeah.
They're awful low for mine,
What do you mean?
for a yearly.
I mean, they're
Yeah.
Yeah.
What,
Well,
I don't,
we
wait,
have-
I'm
we have
missing
the
something.
highest, I think,
I'm
in the
missing
state.
something.
Yeah.
Oh, you guys are in whack.
Yeah, this is the
This
average,
is statewide
state,
Average.
and we're above that.
I'm sure the
Yes,
Now
understand.
to paint it.
Very important to point out, I think, because we have
Yeah.
many different types of utilities. So this is the average, but on average, as the other ones are, it is the stable. Or Bailey, did you have a question?
I did, and I get back to your point. Electricity and VGS are regulated, so shouldn't these numbers really be factored in for the correct inflation rate on the other fuels? Isn't this giving us a different, I mean, right now I'm hearing now utilities are going in for 20% rate increases.
So-
Some of them are going in for 20% rate increases. And
So whenever we present a graph, it's all either the nominal prices in that year or all adjusted for inflation. We always do an apples to apples comparison, and these are the prices that were in that year. So this is not a future forecast. So this is what those prices were.
And you can see average rates have gone up slightly for electricity.
So but I think it's important to say, okay, how did this show up? Because oftentimes when we think about energy costs, we don't think of an energy bill because we might buy gasoline for vehicles every week or two. We might have a fuel oil delivery twice a year. We pay a monthly electric bill. But if you were to total up the change in fossil fuel costs that Vermonters faced in 2021 versus 2022, it's about a $2,500 increase in this example for an average home that eats with fuel oil and a home that has 2 gasoline cars. This was a really significant increase in cost and energy burden for Vermonters because of that price volatility. So this is an example of how those costs would have changed. In terms of ways that we can reduce energy costs over time, this is an example of a household before and after electrification. So on the left-hand side, on the gray side, this is a home that is heating with propane and that is using gasoline. So we mix up the examples to try to meet people where they're at. Some people heat with propane, some with fuel oil, some have 2 cars, some have 1 car. This is an example of heating with propane and 1 gasoline car and the costs that would be faced. And then if instead that home was heating with heat pumps and driving an electric vehicle, you would certainly see an increase in the electricity bill because you're using electricity now to power that vehicle and heat that home. But the net savings, because you would no longer have these bills, and these are using state average rates and costs, that's an example that would be savings of $1,600 plus
On
a year.
average.
On average. And now that's such an important point. There is so much variation in terms of utility territory, in terms of home size, in terms of travel patterns. And, this is, if this was in, you would not see savings from heating electrification if this was a VGS customer.
Mm.
But propane is higher cost and more price volatile than electricity. So this is a propane to electrification example, and gasoline to electrification.
So this wouldn't be showing the cost to convert,
That's right.
which would increase.
Both of them. Yes, because there's a lot of, so one of the ways that we can do, you would have to look at this, is if at the end of life, say the end of a vehicle life, end of a heating system life, what would the equipment purchase cost be on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side? And there's so much variation in those because of federal, state, and utility incentives, some that exist, some that are not going to exist. It's really difficult. This is just a fuel cost calculation at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to reiterate that it's not including the cost to be able to convert.
Yes.
Or to stay the same.
Which is quite an amount of money.
Yeah, the upfront cost is an important hurdle that we need to work on to get there.
Oh,
Right. Alan?
no. To put this in the net metering perspective, is that if somebody is getting a prepay or a rebate or some assistance in acquiring something, somebody else makes that payment. Comes from dollars collected from taxpayers
Yeah, that's paid.
somewhere.
No, that's paid by ratepayers, but yes.
Well, no, but that was, so. Anyway.
Well, except that these savings are coming from improved efficiency.
I understand that, but what you had made the mention in there about the incentives to convert and
Yes,
so
yes.
forth. And there's an incentive for people to put up solar. There,
In that one.
the comment of solar installers saying that house has too much solar panels, they don't know what's plugged into the driveway. They don't know what's on the backside of the house for heat exchangers. They're just looking, here's a cape, there's a cape, here's a ranch, that one's got more than that one.
Representative Tory?
Yeah, I'm gonna be excited to see the information on the right. Over time, when we see like the EV rates really go into effect across the state.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about like a heat pump rate.
Yeah.
Because boy, those
Yeah.
winter electric bills are big. I wonder, is that the kind of stuff you'll track for folks?
It's a great point. I mean, we always try to present information very conservatively. And so this is assuming average retail rates. These numbers could be much lower, exactly as you're saying, if someone's charging that vehicle on an EV rate rather than the average residential electric rate. And, I know that I'm not fully up to speed with what may be happening on heat pump rate design. I know other states, including Massachusetts, are looking at developing heat pump rates. I think that there's some important differences between their context and ours, but I think it's worthy of exploration for sure. I've shared this with you before. This is an example of different types of water heating. And this gets to the point that you were making, Representative Southworth, about how important it is to factor in that upfront cost of the equipment. And so if we just look at how much on average, and these are numbers from the state technical reference manual on costs over time. There's variation in the upfront cost of these units, but we used an average of purchase cost plus installation cost. So this isn't just the equipment, it's also installing it. It is less expensive upfront to purchase and install a propane water heater, oftentimes, than it is a heat pump water heater, which you see at the top of this green line. But over time, the cost to fuel that propane water heater is much more than the cost of electricity to heat your water with an electric heat pump. The reason you see this range here is because there are incentives that can bring the upfront purchase cost of a heat pump water heater down to zero. But how much you pay for the purchase and installation depends on different incentives, different income qualifications, et cetera. But the fuel cost savings over the life of over this period, the 12-year period, which is a conservative lifetime estimate in the technical reference manual, is about $4,300 in fuel savings comparing a residential heat pump water heater to a residential propane water heater.
Reps Southworth.
Has there been any look into electric on demand? I know there's propane on demand, but for the sake of this, we'll look at electric on demand, where it's not heating constantly those gallons of water.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself to me seems like it would be an electric savings
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
And I didn't know whether that's anything that's been looked into or thought about and compared to in this.
Yeah, I mean, that's not shown on this graph, but it's a great point that there are different ways of heating water, and that I know that was a strategy for a long time.
Yeah, it just seems like it'd bring that cost shift back down when you're looking at the heat pump hot water versus on demand hot water. It would just bring that cost over the lifespan of it down.
Yeah,
Which line are you talking about? It bringing down?
So the possible lifetime costs on the green, it would just bring that 6,500 down.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we could look at a comparison of
Just
different.
a thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. Know the technology's out there.
I will say, when I looked into this 4 or 5 years ago, heat pump water heaters couldn't keep up with on demand. They could only do it with a tank. And I don't know if there are resistance electric water heaters that can, heat it as fast as you're using it in a shower. But
Then
when I
you
looked
don't
at
have
it
the
last time,
efficiency advantages.
the heat pumps couldn't do it.
Mine has 2 modes.
You're-
I can switch to electric. I can switch my heat pump hot water heater to
To
electric
resistance
resistance
electric.
when I have a lot of people in the house and
Okay.
running out of hot water.
No, I don't think I do it though.
That was just a thought. Sorry, I didn't want to take this on.
No, these slides are very rich as always. Thank you. Go ahead.
Well,
Oh,
and
sorry.
further comment, I think that the on-demand electric are small units, as I recall. That you might have an on-demand electric for each sink in the house.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that they're
Resistance.
well, they're all resistant, but I think if you really got into it and got out of your salespeople call, that there is a little bit of storage in there, but not the 120 gallon tank that when I was first introduced as a child to electric hot water, you had to have a larger tank. You couldn't get a 40 gallon tank. You had to have an 80 gallon tank or 120.
Holy
But you had,
cow.
but no, because
How expensive that would be.
well, because of it did for the fluctuation of the temperature fluctuation was more like hot air than hot water heat. So you adjust the cost a little more as you continue.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, Chair James has a question. And I saw you, Rep. Bailey.
It's not really a question so much as
Time.
a
Time.
reflection. Yeah, I really appreciate these slides too, and I appreciate Rep. Southworth's questions about upfront costs and Jared's response. Just because they both mirror every decision I've ever made with efficiency, which is that you know what you're spending now on fuel or gas, and you can get a pretty good idea of what how much less you're going to be spending after on fuel or gas. And that's been a constant in every calculation I've made. How am the cost of the equipment and how that's going to balance out over the savings. And every one of those decisions is really complex, and it's like a person by person, household by household thing. What incentive am I going to qualify for? How much is going to cost me to weatherize? What does it cost to lease a fuel car versus an EV? And so I guess I just wanted to acknowledge both comments that there are the savings, the fuel savings that we can kind of quantify, And in helping Vermonters get over that bridge from higher costs for fossil fuels versus lower costs down the road, all the choices and incentives that, that are basically are the bridge that we need to figure out to help folks get there.
Rick Bailey?
Yeah, so on this graph, say all the incentives go away, there isn't any. So we're just looking at the top line of 6,500.
That's right. That would be no incentives.
Which, again, incentives we're all paying these incentives. But
If somebody is somewhere.
These are total installed, these are total costs.
Yes. The line starts with the estimate for equipment and installation, and then over time it rises with the annual fuel costs added on.
These incentives are largely, well, I shouldn't estimate, but they include.
They include
grants.
the way to get it to zero is with the switch and save incentive that Efficiency Vermont has been operating for lower income folks to change out a fossil fueled water heater to a heat pump water heater. But there are other incentives that can be factored in. There's federal tax credits. There are there are as of now in the Inflation Reduction Act. Sometimes there are utility incentives through Tier 3, but the zero is specifically that switch and save program through Efficiency Vermont.
Rep Torrey, we love your slides, Jared.
Yeah, and Jared, you know a lot about this stuff around the country. Are there utilities that have grid integrated pump out water heaters that they're using as storage? Because that's another value for this investment for the homeowner.
Yeah.
If they get a better rate
Yes.
on their electric bill because they're actually a grid asset. Are you aware of other?
It's something I've not heard as much about that as I have in terms of batteries and EV charging. Those tend to be the things that I hear about being incentivized by utilities in terms of the benefits for the grid and for all ratepayers to avoid peaks. I think that my sense, and this could be changing and I could be wrong, but my sense is the additional cost to be able to address water heaters and shift the demand periods. You don't get as much bang for your buck return as you do being able to access batteries and EV charging.
Because they're small.
Yeah, they're just smaller. But there may be folks in utilities that are thinking about that or have more information than I do about that. But that's my initial sense. She looks like she's thinking of it. And so, how is this possible, right? I mean, it's a great point that the incentives are coming from somewhere. Someone is paying for this, whether it's the federal government paid for by federal taxpayers, whether it's state government paid by state taxpayers, whether it's utility incentives paid for by utility ratepayers. But a big portion of these cost reductions is coming from using less energy because of better and more efficient technology. So the example here, we can look at the heating side, which is what we've been talking about. These are, common coefficients of performance or efficiency rates of boilers and furnaces that use combustion. The laws of thermodynamics cap that out at 100%. You can't get more than 100% efficient to generate heat. But heat pump technology works different. You're not generating heat, you're transferring it. You're using the heat, and even when there are very low temperatures in the air or water in the ground, you can still get heat out of it. And using the approach, if we think about it like a refrigerator or like an air conditioner, transferring heat or cold from one place to the other to be able to heat or cool space or water can be done at efficiencies that are much higher than with combustion. It's a similar story on the transportation side. So in a gasoline vehicle, you're using combustion, you're burning gasoline to create propulsion, but a lot of that energy ends up getting lost through heat and other engine losses. So if you imagine all of the gasoline that's put in a car to move it, at the end, only 16 to 25% of that energy is actually delivered to the wheels and moving the vehicle. With an electric vehicle, you get 3 to 4 times more energy efficiency because more of that energy input ends up moving the vehicle and less is lost through heat and other engine losses. And you can recover some through the regenerative braking systems that modern EVs have. And so this is how we can achieve the same results: heat of space, heat water, travel where we want to go for far less energy input and far less cost, because we're moving to more efficient energy technology that's not using combustion, it's using modern electric technology. So I know that we're winding on time. I want to make sure to get to some of the emissions analysis, but I'll just say, so this second part of the economic analysis is on the transportation side, and it's a similar story. Price volatility for gasoline and diesel, and less price volatility, more lower and stable rates for the equivalent cost to charge and run an EV that can result in significant estimated lifetime savings on fuel and maintenance. So this is just an example, and this gets back to Representative Southworth's great point about we've got to look at all-in costs, and that Representative James was speaking to as well. Not just the fuel costs, but the upfront costs. So let's look at this is an apples to apples comparison, a 2025 Chevy Equinox gas vehicle to a 2025 Chevy Equinox EV. It is the upfront MSRP, the sticker price on the Chevy Equinox gas, is lower than it is for the Chevy Equinox EV. But if you look over the life of the vehicle, the maintenance costs and the fuel costs are significantly lower for the EV. It's based on AAA rates and Vermont electricity rates. So such that you can end up achieving, even before incentives, and this green bar could be brought down on the EV side with some of the incentives that still exist if you qualify for them. But even without those incentives, these can be the average lifetime savings, primarily because of the lower operations and maintenance and fuel costs. So we also show the comparative amount of greenhouse gas emissions that come from each vehicle, as we did here with, emissions from a propane water heater over its life, over 12 tons, and using a heat pump water heater with Vermont electricity, emissions from a heat pump water heater, 1/10 of a ton over its lifetime.
Now, go back to the car one. We're talking about incentives, which are not included here, at least on the electric side. We do need to remember that the fossil fuel industry is subsidized $180 billion a year or something. Do I remember that number right?
I would have to,
Yeah.
I'm not.
I mean, there's a giant federal fossil fuel subsidy, which is bringing down the cost of gasoline. And if we, the taxpayers, weren't subsidizing it, it would be higher.
I didn't know that. How were they subsidized?
They get
tax incentives or?
and like exploration leases that are subsidized, that are below market, and R&D credits, and they get a lot of stuff.
So,
Did you have a question, Mark?
No, I was trying to think what I got when pre-84, when you, the pre-86 tax credit, when you invested in, oil exploration, you, didn't pay income taxes. You weren't taxed on the, dollars that were extracted. I forget what they called that now. When tax rates went to 55%, pretty.
I want to do a quick time check with Chair James and with Jared. We have a start time for you of 1 o'clock. I don't know how long you're able to be with us or how long you intended for us to go, Chair James.
Yeah, Jared, I don't know about you. I was thinking we probably wouldn't be done in quite an hour, but I also don't think we need another half an hour or anything. So maybe just, Jared, how many slides do you have left? I'm sorry.
I think I have like 12 slides left, something like that. So
We always under budget.
You're right. We don't need half an hour.
But I'm available to stay if you all are willing, and I think we could probably do it in 15 to 20.
Great. Why don't we shoot for 2:20?
Great.
So this graph gets to the point that Representative Bailey, you brought up in terms of dollar recirculation, and you're absolutely right that in terms of the first dollar spent on fossil fuels, that's going to, if it's sold by a Vermont seller, it's going to those dollars are going to that Vermont business. What this is showing is that next dollar spent and how much stays and recirculates in the state economy versus how much leaves. And because with fossil fuels, most of the cost per gallon is the commodity price of the imported fuel. We don't produce any fossil fuels in Vermont. Most of that next dollar spent is paid for by that fuel dealer or by that gasoline station to pay the out-of-state company who provided them with the fuel. But absolutely, some of that money is staying and recirculating locally to pay the people who work at that gas station, who drive those trucks. But it's a much smaller dollar recirculation share than for electricity, because with electricity, much more of the cost of our rates includes things like paying for line workers, paying for tree trimming, paying for customer service operations, paying for power purchases, much more of which are in Vermont than with the fossil case where no fossil fuel is from Vermont. And some of our electricity dollars leave the state when we're purchasing power from out of state. But even then, rather than going to a global fossil fuel market, it's going to neighbors in New England or Quebec or New York, primarily.
Can I just say, what would be helpful to me, is to show when you spend $1 at the convenience store to buy gasoline,
Yeah.
how much goes to the convenience store owner, how much goes to the distributor they bought the gas from, and how much went all the way out of state.
Yeah. Well, Fuel Dealers Association have that information.
I think you're ready.
So I wanted to start with the economic analysis, what this means for our state economy, what it means for household and business budgets. But there's also implications for the data we analyzed in the tax department and other sources for our statewide greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll briefly.
And before we, and I just want to say, I very much connect those two things together, because emissions is measuring the transition of energy. Just thank you for that moment of editorial for my.
Okay. So setting our context, the darker colors show our historical emissions as a state broken down by sector. So transportation has long been the highest, the largest source of emissions, then thermal, and then you see electricity, agriculture, et cetera. The lighter colors that you see are, they're not historical reported emissions from the ANR inventory. Those stop here in 2021 at 8.28 million metric tons. The lighter colors show what would have to happen to our statewide emissions proportionally to get down to the obligations that we've set to meet our science-based commitments of Vermont doing our part towards the international commitments in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So where does Vermont stand? Again, this is more good news, bad news. This compares what our emissions were in 2005, which is the first baseline year for the Global Warming Solutions Act. So the first target of the Global Warming Solutions Act, first requirement, was a 26% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by January 1st of 2025, or really by 2024. And so you see the 2005 emissions in blue, not just for Vermont, which is darker color to help it stand out, but also for these other levels that we might want to compare ourselves to, the country, the globe, or our neighbors in New England. And Vermont's, and whether you look at 2005 in the blue or the most recent data we have from the ANR inventory, which is 2021, our emissions as a state, our per capita emissions, are significantly lower than the national average, which you see here, and they have been going down. At the same time, we now have the highest per capita emissions of any state in New England, comparing with these neighbors, and about twice the global average. And when you look at our total statewide emissions, comparing 2005 to that most recent year of inventory data, we see that Vermont has reduced our emissions about 16%, which is the least amount of progress towards our many states have equivalents of Global Warming Solutions Act that are also based in line with the Paris Climate Agreement.
Yes.
Right. No, that's not-
Sorry.
So would you say that the 16% decline was mostly from our electric generation sector?
That's a part of it. Part of the challenge is that our electricity sector has always been relatively low emitting. And so we didn't have the same amount of what you might call low hanging fruit as other states that started with dirtier electricity sectors. So the states that have seen some of these more significant declines are places that largely, this isn't, I don't want to be too simplistic about this, but largely moved away from dirtier electricity generation, including oil, including some coal, towards gas, and also towards renewables. But Vermont never had an incredibly high emitting electricity portfolio, at least relative to our neighbors. And so we had less ability to reduce emissions from the electricities. We have the lowest emitting electricity portfolio of any state in the country. But our emissions from transportation and from thermal are, along with Maine, the two highest in the region. We have, and there's lots of reasons for that, but so what this tax department data enabled us to do was to estimate emissions for these two largest emitting sectors, transportation. So in the darker green, you see what these sectors were reported as for their statewide emissions, 2017 to 2021. But we have tax department data from 2022, 23, and 24 for gasoline and diesel, which are the vast majority of the emissions in those sectors. We were able to do calculations to estimate the balance and come up with these numbers for the estimates for the transportation sector. If that sector did its proportional share in line with meeting the first obligation of the Solutions Act, then 2024 transportation sector emissions would have been at 2.92 million metric tons. We're estimating they were about 3.21, so over. Similar story, although less of a gap in the thermal sector. You can see the historical emissions here. You can see the estimates based on largely the tax department and the VGS data over here. This is what the proportional target line would have been for the thermal sector. We're estimating it was a little bit above, about 100,000 tons. And so that creates a deficit for us of about, we're estimating about 370,000 tons over where we would have wanted to be in those two sectors, that if we were to meet the statewide emissions reduction goal would have to be made up for by other sectors that have yet to be measured. The challenge is, and so you can see, not accounting for the transportation and thermal emissions, we would have, those other sectors, which are agriculture, electricity, industrial processes, waste management, would have needed to be at this purple line. But because of the excess emissions from transportation and thermal, we would now need to see all of these other sectors combined be at this orange line in order to come in under the statewide requirement. But the challenge is that almost all of those sectors have been relatively flat in their emissions. They don't move that much. The sectors that move the most, generally speaking, in terms of emissions reduction, have been in the electricity sector, especially post-passage of the first renewable energy standard. The transportation sector, we've seen significant declines. But for these other sectors where we would need to see additional reductions from because of the overages in transportation and thermal, if you look at the last 5 years of data, they've been relatively flat or even increasing a little bit, except for the electricity sector. But it's it's lower emitting than all of these other sectors. So even if it goes down, a significant percentage, you're starting, it's not that much of a starting point.
I'm sure I knew this at one point, but on that last slide, why do electric emissions go up 20 to 21?
Why did they go up? most of the emissions in our electricity sector are related to the portion of electricity that we purchase in our portfolio from the ISO New England residual mix. And so it's just the shifting amount of our portfolio of how much we're purchasing from ISO New England. It's a slight increase, but it's really small. I can get
Yeah,
those numbers.
no, why, it's just that it's going up at all.
Yeah, we do anticipate that over time this is going to go to zero with
Right.
at least by 2030 with the rest. And so you add all this up, the estimates for transportation and thermal, and then what we said was, again, we want to be conservative here. It would be plausible if each of these sectors moved up or down within the range that we've seen in the last 3 years. So let's give them the maximum they might move that we've seen in the last 3 years, or and then add that up or add that down so we get a range. And so when you do that, what we estimate is that our statewide emissions were likely between 7.75 and 8.29 million metric tons, which even in a best case scenario was significantly above the statewide target of the first emissions reduction obligation of the solutions. So I told you I was going to end with good news. I think this is one of my last slides, is that, let me start with the second bullet point. The fact that we almost certainly did not meet our first obligation under the Global Warming Solutions Act is not because it was not possible to do so. It is because we have failed to implement the policies that could help to significantly cut pollution while cutting costs. We see across the country and in the world that there are jurisdictions that are managing to cut pollution and costs, and to do so ahead of their legal schedules. We see this in California, we've seen this in Quebec, and so, but where we have seen, this goes back to your point, Representative Torrey, where we have seen the durable pollution reductions have been in the sectors where we've been willing to apply proven policy and regulatory solutions. The electricity sector, we are part of Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's a cap and invest program that helps reduce electricity sector emissions. We've invested in efficiency measures through Efficiency Vermont to reduce electricity use. We have a renewable energy standard, performance standard, to reduce pollution from electricity generation over time. We have not yet, as a state, applied. We have a policy gap in the transportation and thermal sectors where we don't have performance standards. We don't have emissions caps or market-based systems like we do in the electricity sector for thermal and transportation. The states that are in the jurisdictions that are achieving more significant reductions, like California, like Quebec, they are applying those policy solutions in those sectors. So my message is that it is still possible to meet future Global Warming Solutions Act obligations, but emissions don't, unfortunately, go down on their own, and it requires market changes, clear market directions in the form of proven policies and regulations. And that would mean looking to and learning from and working with other jurisdictions that are making more progress than we are. But we have a strong starting point. You can see, as I started with, Vermonters are taking action to cut pollution and often cut costs through their adoption of these key measures: cold climate heat pumps, weatherization, electric vehicles. And again, you've already seen this, but this is our dashboard of where that's happening around the state. And you can see that we're making different levels of progress in relation to the climate action plan targets. And at the end of this presentation just has the direct data on the fuel sales. So if you don't want to do a data request of the tax department, you just want to see what the sales were for these different fuels in these different years, this is the background data that we used to do a lot of this analysis, in both in terms of what it means for the Vermont economy and emissions. So, and there's other interesting material in here. We did a paper last year that dug into changes in the thermal sector. You know, we're seeing overall some slight declines in fossil fuel use in the thermal sector, But if you look fuel by fuel, there's some very different trend lines. Much steeper reduction in fuel oil use, but we're actually seeing increases in propane use. And anyway, that would take more time than I have today to get into, but I just want to note that we published a paper last year that interviewed some experts about in the fuel industry and in the building trades about why they think that is happening.
Yeah, I would just note that that 15% reduction in fuel oil and kerosene sales really aligns with what we've been hearing from industry about consolidation. And one of the things that I've been really worried about lack of competition in some regulated market. So it's interesting to see.
So we get money for weatherization from taxing propane and fuel oil and kerosene. Okay,
And-
so it looks like the trend line here, which we should take both of those together, the 11 positive and the negative 15. Are we going to see a drop in what funding we have for weatherization from that source?
I mean, when we've analyzed this data, what we found is that the single largest factor in the declining fossil fuel use is warming winters. 2024 was the warmest winter ever recorded in Vermont. And so regardless of electrification and how much we do with heat pump water heaters, advanced wood heat as well, I would expect that we would see, all else being equal. I mean, this doesn't account for population change, but all else being equal, just because of our warming winters, I would expect that we're going to see fewer fuel sales, which would reduce the revenues available for weatherization. I'm going to see if I have.
I think I heard that from a witness from OEO who said that was
See if I have a slide on
concern
that.
from them.
Yeah, so we don't have it statewide, but if you want to see, this is the data from Burlington. Oh, this is extreme heat days. That's not heating degree days. Second. Oh, geez.
Do you expect 2025 to top 2024?
I don't. I think it's too early to tell. I mean, the early January and February were pretty cold.
Yeah.
So I would be surprised, but who knows what the rest of the year and what the fall and early winter season will hold. I'm sorry, I don't have the slide. I thought I did on heating degree days.
From Sam Powell?
On this slide here, do you think that some of the change is the cost? I see fossil gas and propane went up, but from the perspective of people that I see moving to propane, they move to propane because it's cheaper now when they replace their oil burner with propane.
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge is that I'm sorry, I meant to go right to that slide, is that looking at a per gallon basis, propane looks less expensive than fuel oil, at least for retail rates, but it only has about 2/3 of the energy content of fuel oil. So you need more gallons to keep the same space.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to look not just at the price per gallon, but the price for the amount of delivered heat and the total cost over the heating season. But I think that there's a lot of things happening here. One is there are red tag rules related to oil tanks. And we analyzed this in the paper last year, but what we heard from both DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, and a number of heating contractors is that if somebody gets a red tagged oil tank that had been in their basement,
Right.
and they don't want to buy a new oil tank to put in their basement, the benefits of a propane to them would be that the propane tank can be outdoors and they can lease it rather than purchase it. So you don't have that same upfront cost.
Interesting.
And then with new construction, what I've heard from builders is that it's very rare that they will recommend fuel oil systems. Propane is seen as more versatile. So if you're doing a new multifamily or single family home, you can use outdoor propane tanks for your space heating, your water heating, fireplace, your cook stove, whereas you wouldn't normally use fuel oil for all of those purposes. There's other, the leasing of the tank, propane tanks can store more fuel, so maybe you only get one delivery in the winter rather than you might need multiple for fuel. There's all sorts of things going on. I also wouldn't be surprised if it is what people are seeing as the per gallon price advertised, which is not the same as the cost to heat a home because of the differences in energy content between propane and fuel oil, which is a worry.
You put an eye there. I thought it was total heating cost for the home was, but it may be
That's per gallon.
No, it wasn't per gallon. It was that you could heat. I mean, I don't know what the difference of the price is between the energy of a 20-pound tank. I've seen gone from $12 to $20 last time I filled the barbecue.
Yes.
But
I want to see if we have a graph that compares the price of,
BTUs per dollar.
Yeah, exactly.
BTUs per dollar.
And we do have one of those. I don't think I have it. I don't know, Lena, if you may have that handy. I don't have it in this presentation, but I will send that to you.
I do have it if you want me to pull it up.
Okay, great.
Recording.
Quick data question for you. Is yellow tagging and red tagging, is that public information? Like if we wanted to be able to track?
Yeah, and we actually link to the DEC numbers that were provided to us in this report we did last year. And so it says how many red tags have been delivered. And so we try to use that to say how much of that is a factor. Thank you, Lena. Do you want to talk through this, please?
Sure, yeah. So this is I believe this is just looking at an example of the price comparison in 1 month. Yeah, it's from December 2023. So these prices will change over time as one of the graphs that Jared showed previously shows you. But this is just an example of in 1 month how the price per gallon on the left-hand side compares between propane and fuel oil versus the price per unit of heat delivered because of the difference in the energy content of fuel. So propane contains 66% as much energy per gallon of fuel as fuel oil does. So this is just to help show that comparison.
That's not in here. Could
Just I did a quick search because I was not at all sure about my memory of the federal subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And it looks like there's this big stack. And again, a very quick search. There's like $20 billion in direct subsidies. And then there's $30 billion in reduced cost leases and that sort of thing. And then the IMF estimate for the US subsidy is like $760 billion, but most of that is kind of social cost of carbon. It's not that direct. So somewhere between 0 and $800 billion is the accurate subsidy.
We got it 0.
Jared, don't take that down. So you can
Oh,
share
yeah.
that.
Lena, and thank you for sharing that. If you can stop sharing now, that'd be great.
I just want to thank you, Chair James, for arranging for this testimony. It is so helpful for us to have this type of analysis and for you to back it up with the data links. We're able.
Did you do that?
The chair is very happy.
It wasn't supposed to be quite that over the top. That was
Chair
just
James,
supposed to be a quick
multiple thumbs
indicator.
up.
I heard you. Yeah.
Chair James, is there anything else you'd like to wrap with here?
I don't think so. Thanks as always to coming in. Jack and I are working on the agenda for next week and hoping to start diving into AI and cybersecurity a little bit. Plus we have our field trip. So I guess we'll keep you all posted.
Okay, yes, our field trip is Wednesday.
Field trip is Wednesday to core.
Okay, Wednesday at 4.
You got a 60.
No,
Core.
at 9 to
At
core.
Invested in
Okay.
Technology.
oil exploration.
Okay,
When-
great. Thank you very much, Jared and Lena. And we'll go off live. We won't